Hello.
Hello, friends. Hello. Welcome, everybody.
Hello.
Hello, hello. We'll give it a minute while everybody gets on here and settled. Joe, you made it. I'm glad to see you.
I did. It's a miracle. Everything's a miracle.
Everything's a miracle. Isn't our modern world a miracle? We'll get to that in a second. Well, welcome, everybody. Good to see so many of you here.
Look at that, Mary Tracy.
What's that?
Good to see you too.
Good to see you. Good. Let me do the official welcome and then we will jump right in. All right, I have an official welcome I have to do. Welcome to the Bailey's Harbor Book Discussion, a part of NEA Big Read Door County. NEA Big Read is a program of the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with Arts Midwest. So we've been doing Door County Reads for quite a number of years. The first few years was a part of NEA Big Reads, and we've kind of done a few years on our own. This year we were able to write a grant and be part of NEA Big Reads again. So a lot of exciting things happened with that. Station 11 was published in 2014. And this group that meets, you used to meet here when we could meet. The Bailey's Harbor group that meets here read this in the spring of 2019. So for how many of you was this the second or third time you read it?
Second for me.
Yeah. So a few of us, not quite half maybe. But I imagine even those of you that have read it before, you read it with a little different perspective this time around.
I would say.
Yeah. And this will probably be a very different discussion than what we had back in spring of 2019 as well. I mean, one, we're not in person. I'm not looking at you across the table, I'm looking at you on a screen. And the author has said about Station 11 that she wanted to write about the world in which we live, but yet we take things for granted. And one interesting way to write about the modern world was to write about its absence, which to her brought out a lot of questions. What does the world look like without electricity, telecommunications, without airplanes? What would survive? So what do you think? Knowing she wanted to do that, did she succeed and still make it a believable story? Go ahead, Jane.
Yeah, I think she did. And I think you're right. I found this true of all books, and there haven't been that many that I've read twice. But I found it true of all books I've read twice. You always get you get more out of it the second time and think a little deeper about things. And the thing that I recall this time that she really pointed out, because I think it's happened with our current situation with COVID-19 somewhat, is you take for granted the people who are doing the jobs that you usually do not notice, that don't get the respect for the work that they're doing because it's so common to a lot of people. And the fact that many of them have lost their jobs, and shops have closed and restaurants are closed, and it's just harder. We can't come to the library, not that you've lost your job, Tracy, thank God. But, those things that you just take for granted aren't there anymore. And I thought that was, to me, that was very interesting. Yeah, I thought it was believable. And I pass. To someone else.
It was interesting, the second read on this. My recollection of this book was that it was primarily about the people in the Shakespeare troupe. That's what I remembered the most. And that was only one small part of it. There was a whole lot more that I just didn't remember that much. And mostly, I guess what I didn't remember was Miranda and her graphic novel. She was a whole lot of this book. And I would say if there's anything I kind of don't get is how much time and effort she spent and years on this graphic novel. She's kind of an enigma to me as a character. I don't understand her really.
I raised my hand to say I'd read it twice, but it was more like it took me, this was actually the third time I picked this book up to read it. I remember, Tracy, you gave it to me. I wasn't here for the book club read, but you suggested it when I was looking for a book to read. And I took it home and I couldn't get into it. And I tried it a second time. And this time I just sort of forced my way through the first half of the book. I don't know. I couldn't connect with it for some reason. I mean, obviously I connect a little more now because of what's happening to us as well. But the way she wrote it, I don't know. It was difficult for me.
I'm jumping.
Sue, what were you going to say? Sue, you're muted.
I'm too used to my exercise class. There were two things. I found it very hard to read because you just kind of get into one topic of it and then she'd switch to other characters. So that I found hard, but I made myself read it. And I guess I'm thankful I'm not one of the few people left right now. I guess that kind of made me think maybe I'm more grateful now because this is a terrible situation. But at least I'm not the last man standing, so to speak.
Go ahead, Linda.
I just wanted to mention, because Karen mentioned Miranda, that at the Egg Harbor Book Club, which I listened to a bit of it, they played a clip of an interview with the author, and she said that she liked Miranda so much that she carried her over into the Glass Hotel for one line in that book. I just thought that was interesting.
With Miranda, I was kind of wondering if there was parts of the author to Miranda. Did anyone else get any feeling about
Could
that?
be.
I kind of did.
I
Jane?
could see that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I hadn't thought about that until you said that, and I've listened to some of the interviews also and read some things. The author started out as a dancer, but she said she pursued that till she was 20 something, I think, went to school for it and so forth. But she had always written because she was homeschooled and she had to write something every day. So Miranda had a whole different career, but at night when she was traveling in the hotel room, she would always get out her pencils and her drawings and work on the Station 11. I don't want to call it a comic necessarily. What's the new
Graphic novel.
Thank you. So in her kind of her after real work in her world life, she would work on this graphic novel. So yeah.
That's interesting though. They don't ever in the book call it a graphic novel.
No, they call it a
It's
comic.
called a comic book.
Yeah.
So I don't know, when did graphic novel, quote unquote, come into
I don't know.
effect?
Find out.
That's an interesting point.
We're reading one next time, so that'll be good.
I have a son-in-law who loves graphic novels, or I still call them comic books. And he likes that the illustration-y kind of stuff and the way. Anyway, I'm not wild about them, but he loves them.
My daughter-in-law is a associate professor. She has a PhD in literacy, education and literacy, and she's written co-authored two books about using graphic novels in high schools, how to do that. So they're they've become a pretty popular thing, I think, among younger people.
I kind of use that technique in my books. That's kind of what I did with my children's books.
Right, exactly.
Speaking of the comics, does anyone see a connection to the comic books that she was writing and illustrating to the novel and the story as a whole? Were there any connections or any metaphors that you saw?
Well, I was thinking, you know, they're all in the graphic novel. I really like the aspect of the graphic novel, and Miranda, I thought she was one of the most interesting characters in the book. But she, in Station 11, they're all living in islands. They're not really connecting. And there's the whole undersea world. There's, you know, the danger is inherent because there's no overarching law and order. I think it certainly reflects the society that, well, the upper Midwest there around Lake Michigan has become. And they all live in islands. It talks about bridges and how it got flooded. So you have mountaintops and so forth. So I think the isolation of the characters in Station 11 absolutely reflects what's going on in the geography and the demographics of the novel itself. So I think they're a direct reflection of each other. One is projected into the future, into a fantastical world, but I'm not sure that it's any more fantastical than the world that that we're watching these people redevelop and walk through without any of the modern conveniences. And they're each fantastical in their own way, almost science fiction. I thought there was an interesting parallel way to tell a story. And it didn't bother me that she worked on them so much. I saw it sort of as a form of knitting. I mean, some people knit enough to drive you nuts. And so she just is drawing stories. So I thought it was believable.
Yeah. Was it to Arthur? She said, you don't have to understand it. It's mine, or something to that effect. Like it was basically
true, I think, of people who produce art. If somebody else gets it or gets a different message, terrific. But generally speaking, they're producing it because it's what they want to do.
Hi.
Hi, Janet.
How are you?
Good.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jan Nelson. Nice to see you all. I saw it as a real thread throughout the entire novel because it's what connected Arthur, once Miranda was out of the picture, to the prophet, because that's how the prophet got a hold of the book. And because Arthur sent it to his son, and that's how Kirsten got it. That's how Kirsten wound up with those key pieces. So other people in the Shakespeare group knew about Station 11 just because she brought it out and looked at it all the time, at least the people close to her. So it seemed to me to be one of the major threads that held all of these different storylines together. And I think it was Jane who said something earlier, maybe, so yours just says admin, so I don't know your name. Somebody who's
Renee?
Oh, yeah.
Renee. Sorry.
Hi, Renee. How are you? I guess everybody's email address or whatever it is. It was interesting because I think because the author kept jumping back to Arthur and to, you know, the play, the night that he died, and to his wives, that really helped me out because I don't like dystopian fiction. And the only reason I read the book is because it was the book that you were going to be talking about. Because I don't really like dystopian fiction very much. And so to me, it was such a relief every time she went away from the prophet and away from all of the scary new world and got back to these other storylines. So the jumping around actually helped me.
So with all of these storylines and all the jumping around, do you feel there was one main character? Was there a focus?
I think Kirsten was to me, Kirsten was the main character. Because we saw her, you know, we met her as a little 8-9-year-old girl, and even though they're, Javon was, I don't know if that's pronounced correctly, was another character for a while. She would, to me, she was a thread throughout the story. And as Janet was saying, connected via the Station 11 graphic novel.
And even though Arthur was kind of the connection that connected a lot of these people in these
Yeah.
stories together, he
I
didn't
would have
really.
almost said Arthur might have been the
so?
main thread through it.
Yeah.
Clark certainly did, and Clark persisted throughout the entire novel.
That's true. Yeah.
Night when Arthur died, he knew a lot of the people. He didn't know the Shakespeare troupe, but he was aware of the young girl on the stage. And then, of course, he's right through to the end in the Museum of Civilization, which was, in fact, his idea. The Museum of Civilization is what he compiled at the airport. So he also was a connecting thread. I think that's one of the things she did remarkably well, was all of these various threads, mixing up the timeline like she did. You had to pay attention. But I thought the way she wove them together and brought us up to date, but then would send us right back to fill in the blanks. I thought she did a remarkable job of making it in a cohesive story by the time we finished up.
I agree.
I think she's an outstanding author, just is able to do what she wants to. I did read The Glass Hotel, and it was less fresh to me. I liked it, but I think, again, she used some of the same devices, and I didn't find it as intriguing as in this one.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that one of the other threads was how she gave all those people so much humanity throughout the book while they were going through all these horrible, situations, and that just seemed to me. And of course, the culture, the fact that they all wanted to retain culture in their lives despite the worst of circumstances.
Yeah,
which is why NEA is sponsoring all this.
I mean, it really is a story of resilience. These people were really resilient. And I think also in the Glass Hotel, a lot of those people also were very resilient.
I think that's true of human beings. I mean, I think in any apocalyptic book that you read, or horrible situation like this, I do think that the human person comes through, other than we also see the anarchists that come through who decide they're going to be the ones that rule the world, now that the world is not what it used to be, and with the profit. And I think we still see that even today, even though we're not in a total pandemic situation, we do still see those quote unquote prophets who want to rule over people, who want to, I call them the cults that we see. And yet we still are able to see humanity come through. I mean, Kirsten was pretty interesting that she tattooed knives for every person that she killed. I thought that was okay. Why would you want that constant reminder tattooed on your body? But, I don't know, maybe that's what she needed to do to get over it.
Well, it also serves as a warning to others. I mean,
but did everybody know that that's what that meant?
Well, at the end.
At the end, we find that out, but does everybody on the road that meets her knows that she's killed people because she's tattooed those on her arm?
I got the impression she wasn't the only one doing that, so maybe it was kind of
I did too.
Oh, okay.
Her friend who they finally found at the airport had 4 of those tattooed daggers on her arm.
But I
don't know.
Why do we have to do that? It's kind of like you hear about the young men that would put notches on their belts for every woman that they raped or had sex with. What is it that why do we have to add up those kinds of things?
I didn't get the impression she enjoyed having them necessarily. I
But
didn't
at
get
the
the
end,
impression.
she asked for the, I wouldn't have thought so either until at the end when she asked if there's a tattooist person at the airport. I mean, I thought, okay, well, she really
It's
must.
almost like it's a sign of what her job was, or I'm not sure, but I don't get the impression she would have minded if she didn't have them. You know,
Maybe it's because she didn't want to forget that she had done this. You know, it was a reminder to herself or to anybody. It's a reminder to them that that they had to do this horrible thing, that they actually took a life.
Yeah, that's what I thought it was. It was kind of a symbol of the price of surviving in this world that they now had to live in. So not so much a badge of honor, just as a badge of perhaps, what you had to do to survive, and to let people know that you were willing to do whatever it took to survive. You weren't just going to lie down and let them have their way with you, like the prophet was kind of ruling with an iron fist and meting out all sorts of horrible punishments whenever he felt like it. I think those knives were a sign that she wasn't going to be one of those people who let someone else do that to her.
that's interesting. That's interesting. That was Maya. Is that how you pronounce her name?
Yes, it is.
Maya. There's a quote that I really liked, and it said, "If you are the light, if your enemies are the darkness, then there's nothing that you cannot justify. There's nothing you can't survive, because there's nothing that you will not do." So her job was to use her skill. We never do learn how she developed that skill of knife throwing to help them all survive. I thought that was really an interesting quote. And that's part of that resilience. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a whole year of her life she just had no recollection of. She just did not remember it.
Yeah.
And probably because that year was so horrible.
She's 9.
She blocked it. Yeah. She didn't,
9 years old.
her mind didn't rejected those memories because they were just too painful.
Right. And she had a jagged scar, they say, on her cheek, but we never learn how that happened either.
Anyone feel they need to start throwing knives at trees, sharpen up their skills a bit? Just
No, but a few years ago, I had this thought about getting the old pump at the old cottage going in case something ever happened to all the water.
Mm-hmm.
We had a pump years ago before we had electricity at the old cottage. So I remember those days with no electricity, no running water in the cottage, just the outhouse, the pump outside, an ice box. The iceman would come and a kerosene lamp. Yeah.
Wow.
That's how old I am. Isn't that awful?
Jan, were you trying to say something there?
I really did like that she didn't go into a lot of detail on situations where the detail would have just been horrifying and wouldn't have really advanced the plot. So Maya just mentioned that Kirsten had blocked out that year because she finally realized it must have been just too awful to remember. And that at one point her brother, before he died, said, you don't want to remember. So didn't really need, we can describe the detail of what probably happened to her on the road that first year. There were several points where she mentioned a character and then said, and 3 weeks later she would be dead, and he died 3 days later. And she didn't need to tell us why. I mean, 95% plus of the earth succumbed to this pandemic. So I appreciated that. I didn't feel as though I needed any more of the horrible stories than were already there. I mean, it was hard enough to deal with the stories about the prophet and, so I thought she did a really good job of that, creating the sense of the horror that had transpired without feeling like she needed to give us all the detail.
Mm-hmm. I think that's part of the reason I enjoyed the book as much as I did, and it kind of pulls it apart from other dystopian. Not that this is completely dystopian, but some of them are, all the bad and all the gruesome. And you're right, your imagination can fill that part in. You don't need the You don't need all the details. And especially right now, we don't want all the details.
Too close to home.
So the line survival is insufficient. Why is that important? What does that mean? Or what does it mean to you?
Say that again, Tracy.
Survival is insufficient. That was the
Oh,
the
yeah.
line from Star Trek, and the traveling troupe adopted it and put it on their caravans.
That's where the culture comes in.
Mhm.
That's simply surviving is not enough. You have to have more.
Mhm.
You have to have art. You have to have music,
Theater, right?
theater, right?
Well, I think you have to have hope. If you don't have hope, I think surviving would be impossible in a way. So hope, but having that culture brings back that hope that there is a way to still enjoy your surroundings, enjoy each other.
Were
And
you
you have
at-
people-
Were you at all surprised that 20 years into this, we haven't gotten electricity going yet? That seems strange to me. I would have figured that there were enough bright with it people, even in that last 5%, that would have done that. It was a surprise to me.
Yeah, I had to suspend disbelief for that one because that's far-fetched that it would take that long.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Right, because there was still water. You know,
Yeah.
But I agree that it
They
was
could make
20
dance.
years,
Or a wheel. Yeah, yeah.
20 years and nothing had progressed.
Until the very end, right? Didn't they
We
see
saw.
electricity off in the distance?
They did.
Yeah.
So I don't, maybe it's that if you're just trying every day to survive, and that there isn't much extra there for that kind of entrepreneurship, to use, I guess, one word. They had to be so clever just to get through the day. You know, and they'd figured out hunting, and they'd figured out, I don't know, survival techniques, I guess.
Maybe it
But
requires.
somewhere in those big cities, there had to, I'm with Karen, that there had to have been somebody working to get them back, because the knowledge was there. I mean,
Right.
it's not like they were starting from scratch.
Right.
All they were trying to do is get it back again. And I agree too. It was kind of
Yeah.
what happened to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if it had to do with their location of being in the Midwest. And we know that a lot of, Silicon Valley and big businesses and technology are on the coasts. So there wasn't the same sort of materials and supply and people, the same number in the Midwest that were available. Maybe people were working on it in other places.
Well, I was thinking
wonder.
too that maybe you have to have a certain society. You have to have a certain level of society and laws and civility to have that arise
That's true.
to that level.
Well,
I was,
and the financial system was down. You know, how do you get something going without money to pay for it? I mean, it was, I don't think we understand what total destruction is.
But it wasn't like the world was destroyed with like something hitting planet Earth. It was that so many people were killed. There were so few people left on Earth. But even back when this book was written, there must have been lots of people with solar power and, who could generate their own electricity off the grid. That I thought that part of it was really unrealistic because
Good point.
How do you interpret the climate change that they were living in? Because there was a different climate, wasn't there? Or am I just incorrect about that? Because
It seemed hot. It seemed hot.
Yes, yes, and they were in like Michigan most of the time, and summers in that part of Michigan are not blistering. So
Yeah, I don't know.
I wondered how that was interpreted, actually.
Good question, Karen.
I think that, yeah, I agree. That was a little strange. Yes, because Door County, I don't have air conditioning and I don't feel like I need air conditioning. So you wouldn't think that part of Michigan either would be so, yeah.
It's interesting.
So which airport do you think was modeled after? I was thinking it was O'Hare.
I did. I thought it was.
I
Yeah.
looked it up and it's fictional.
Yeah.
And somewhere I found someone asking her that question, like, is there really a Severn city? And she said no, and she didn't want it to be as recognizable as O'Hare or Detroit. So she said, picture an airport more around the size of Grand Rapids. Well, I've never been to Grand Rapids Airport, so that doesn't mean much to me, but just kind of a mid-sized airport. She, for whatever reason, even though she referred to Chicago and Detroit and other recognizable places like resort cities in Michigan, she said she felt it was important for that to be fiction. I Googled it.
Does Gary, Indiana have an airport? I don't know. Because that would be,
Never heard of one.
Yeah.
that would
I
be
don't
near
think
the,
so.
Yes, my husband says yes.
No?
The thing that the
that
other
would be
thing
near
though
the
is-
water.
What? No, I was just that was the other thing too, that they always have plenty of water. And, you know, I mean, they did talk about melting snow to flush the toilets, but, you know, after a while, even all of that had to clog up, didn't it? I mean, if you don't have a sewer, you know, thing going.
Sewage plant running or something, yeah.
Right. Yeah, the sewage, that would be limited for sure after a few years, you would think.
But they talked about it after they got to the airport, when the symphony and all of them were there at the airport. They still talked about
Right, flushing,
having
yeah.
water and toilets, and I don't know. I wondered how that all worked.
Well, the
So if
prophet was chilling.
The prophet what?
The prophet was chilling.
Yeah.
And I kept thinking of someone used the word cult a little bit ago. The other, self-described
Yes.
leaders of these cults who really, see themselves as godlike people. And of course she would know about Jim Jones and, the guy in Waco, Texas, and these people. Even in our country, there have been several of these leaders who feel that it's their divine right to have any number of wives. And then more chilling than the prophet is all the people who fell in with the prophet. It was just, it's such an age-old story. And
It
But
is.
interesting that it was his mother. Wasn't it Elizabeth who was, kind of on the religious side that pushed her son to, he was reading the Bible all the time and doing all
think a
that
little
sort of
bit,
thing when he was a young boy. It was like almost she had pushed him into that sort of life to think that he was going to be able to become the prophet. I don't know.
And then
Yeah,
they
except
kind of
didn't it come out that his holy book actually was Station 11?
No.
Because
I don't remember that.
He had a New Testament or something too, didn't he?
Yeah.
That handed to him at the very end.
a
Yeah,
lot
and-
of it was from the book of Revelations.
Right,
He stood next
right.
to the airplane reading the book of Revelations.
right.
which
I remember that.
Correct.
Yeah.
Not a book of the Bible that I'm all that familiar with, but it seemed obvious that from the very beginning, that he was going to be the one who was going to turn into the prophet, just because they kept referring to her son. And they weren't referring to anybody else's extended family, but they kept referring to Elizabeth's son, even before anyone ever named him. And I thought, well, surely he's got to be the one who's going to turn out to be the prophet. He's the only person who keeps getting referred to over and over again who's a young person. So
That also was the thread back to Arthur, because Arthur was so, before he died, in that big chapter talking about what he was thinking about before he died, he wanted to get back to
his
Israel. He wanted to
son.
be able to see his son and talk to him
Right.
again. And I just thought it was weird that he ended up being the prophet.
Well,
What does
isn't
everybody
it,
else think? Did you see that coming? Did you peg him right away?
I didn't know that I pegged him right away, but I wasn't surprised it was him, because it always seems like it's people with very dysfunctional family relationships who have a certain amount of charisma, attractive appearance, who usually turn out to be those prophets.
And he really did have only 2 books to read. Remember, he was at that airport when he was quite young, and so he
Mhm.
read the Testament, and he had the graphic novels that his father had sent him, and then whatever else was around to read. But you're right, his mother was pushing him. I was not surprised.
Well,
And then of
and they
course it
did-
was confirmed the minute you heard the dog's name was Luli, you know,
Mhm.
Right.
halfway through,
Right.
halfway
That was,
through.
that was
The guy's
quite a big
dog's name is
clue.
Luli, so. Mhm.
Mhm.
and they had been living in Israel, so I'm not sure what kind of religious activity, they had been involved in there and what effect that had on him. And they didn't explain whether the mother, Elizabeth, was raised Jewish or why they were there in Israel. I don't remember.
And they left the airport after only a couple of years. Remember, they followed that
Yeah.
religious group that came through, and then Elizabeth and Tyler left with the religious group. So he spent his early years in
Yeah.
Israel, and then he spent those weird formative years as well, mid years, in a religious group
Yeah,
before he himself became the
Cult.
religious leader.
right.
And we're not told much. We don't know much about that group that they go off with.
Mm-mm.
They showed up and left.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That is one of the interesting things about too, I think, and I think it might have to do with the fact that they might not have, that more communities didn't form co-ops, for instance, to get electricity started. I think what Linda was saying, you have to have a society of a certain size. And one of the things several of the people mention and emphasize is how much they walk. They
Mhm.
simply are walking all the
Yeah.
time, moving from place to place, never settling down because it might not be safe or you might
Right.
not quite fit in. And it just seems to me, we're 20 years into the population growth at the airport, and it's up to a few hundred people, as I recall. I can't quite remember the number, but I do think it takes a certain level of stability and so forth. I do think solar panels would have been around, but I do think it takes at least some semblance of a community to figure out how to do some of these things, a stability factor that has taken 20 years to develop. I got the idea that the electricity that they saw from the tower, the control tower at the airport, was at a place like, like Peoria or something. I mean, it was a long way beyond the horizon. They could just barely see.
Mhm, right.
So,
I have another question for you here. You mentioned about this traveling thing. I have not read a lot of dystopian books, but I do remember reading The Road being
Mhm.
Yeah.
one, and there are some others that I'm aware of too. And Mad Max, that's dystopian. Waterworld, that's dystopian. And everybody's always on the road, kind of, really. So this business about walking, I think that is that a thread that is anyone else a little more well-read in that realm than I am, actually?
Well, I think
No.
because
No, but it's
because
like
they're always
Gypsy
looking for
Caravan.
food. They constantly have to be moving because
Finding food. Mm.
because finding food, staying away from people that they find threatening. Yeah, but you're absolutely right. All those books are that way.
Yeah.
Well, it's like going back to nomadic tribes.
Mm.
Mhm.
But not everyone is constantly on the move. I mean, there's certain people who stay at the airport. There's certain people they see every time they come through town.
Mhm.
Traveling actors and symphony, those people in the town seem stable. They seem the same one every time.
And the group in Virginia, I guess Jeevan walked to Virginia from,
Right,
Yeah.
right.
there
Toronto.
was clearly or Javon, I don't know how you say his name either. There was a settlement there in
Right.
Virginia, which seems to me to be an awfully long walk from northern Michigan, but I guess they had years and years to do it. And
Mhm. That little settlement seemed to be doing quite well. Like they seemed to have a good spot, and they were working cooperatively, and
Yeah.
seemed better than some.
They were
I
just,
don't remember,
they were lucky that the prophet didn't land there.
Mhm.
right.
It was one of the main dangers to people, more than almost anything else, because he had weapons and he was a sociopath. So, and his followers weren't willing to make other decisions, except that one boy who finally killed him.
Boy, yeah.
But so the only reason some of those societies or small communities existed was because nobody had come to tear them apart.
Mhm.
And the airport was a real fortress almost. I mean, it started out with just having a great spot to begin with. And so it made it very conducive for other people to join them because of the size of it. The tower certainly offered the, kind of like a castle. You always had your sentries high up watching for anyone that would come into the fortress without, being invited, et cetera, et cetera. So I think just the airport itself made it very conducive for a community to develop.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't remember who was in charge at the airport. It wasn't Clark, I don't think, right? Who was kind of the director, the man people went to? It was a man. Does anybody remember? And how he got that position at the airport?
I didn't know that there was one person in charge.
I didn't either.
Okay,
I didn't either.
okay.
It seemed pretty cooperative.
Mm-hmm.
And of
Didn't
course, I was
somebody have
definitely.
keys? Didn't someone have all the keys though?
There was
What,
wasn't
Linda?
there a security guard or somebody? So I think.
Well, that was at the start. But then I think, once it became clear that this was not going to be a temporary situation, it
Right.
became
It
operative
got-
and everyone got their own role
Yeah,
that
they
they
were-
were before.
They were organized. Yeah.
I found one of the debates about education interesting, and that was when they were deciding or talking about whether or not it was best to tell the children about what it used to be like, or whether or not to just deal with what we have, because maybe we won't be going back. And that was an interesting discussion about the value of history or not the value of history. And is it different when there's no, I mean, we're not going to go back to the 1400s either. Well, if we're lucky, we won't.
This makes you wonder.
So, so we teach
Can we
about,
quote you on that?
right. So we do teach about it, but is there value in it? Is there value? Another question I have is, what would you save? What would you think was important? I asked my granddaughter when we first read this. She was still probably a senior in high school, and I told her what this author had her characters say, which was, essentially music, fine Western music, fine Western culture, because it is a Western group. That's okay. Western civilization. I said, what would you have? What would you save? And she said, I wouldn't save that. I would save the history of slavery, the history of the Holocaust. I would save those kinds of things to make sure that people understood what we do to each other.
Good
Wow.
for her. Good for her.
Wow.
She
That's
thought
pretty
the
good.
culture-
Yeah.
She thought the culture would take care of it itself. If we didn't save Shakespeare, we might get something else. But she thought that history was important to save.
Wow.
I
agree.
I agree with your granddaughter. I think, again, that's been a topic of conversation just recently about, our Confederate statues and things. And do we continue to wash over slavery? Do we wash over Jim Crow? And our history books have been a little bit lax in keeping us all informed. There's been a lot of things that I had no idea went on. And I agree. I think our history books need to go back and reevaluate what needs to be put in there, and put in there factually, so that
Right.
generations from now on can understand it better.
But we've had
Agreed.
other periods on Earth where there were great civilizations that collapsed and barbarism seemed to take over for a while, and then another civilization emerged. So after the collapse of the Roman Empire, for a long time, there were a lot of warring tribes, but then you started to have the emergence of civilization and culture again. And I mean, the whole Renaissance got its name because they rediscovered what, the Greeks and the Romans had
Greeks
known.
and Romans.
And so it's not that, it was totally lost, but somehow we forgot about it. Maybe like we forgot about electricity in Station 11, and then someone rediscovered it, because I think we go through those kinds of periods in cycles, perhaps.
It's like they say, if you don't learn and remember history, you're doomed to repeat it. And Renee, you're right. I think, there was no mention in our history books of the treatment of Asians in our country in the early years. Obviously, we know a lot about what happened to the Native Americans. The idea, there was not much history about the fact that we stole the land from the Mexican people. We stole their land. And now we want to keep them out, or, we have been wanting to keep.
Yeah.
So I think I would agree that it's important to teach that history, even though it's maybe some things that those children in Station 11 would never come across again, or not for a long time. It's okay to teach them what used to be, to help them think about what should be.
Yeah, I read a book this past year where it talked about the World War II and the Asian population and the internment camps that were in the western part of the States. And it was Daughter of Molokai by Alan Brennert. And
Oh, yes,
really
I've read that.
Mhm.
Yeah, the Hawaiians, all
Yeah.
those people.
I was a
If you
history
notice, they did
Brad.
start school. That was something that I found reassuring, I guess, because they didn't at the end of the book we find out that they had the children were going to school.
They were in Virginia, I think.
So, education, learning about what things are, where we've come from, what we've been through. We have to have it. We have to have it.
History is such a broad term. It's what you choose to remember, what you choose to teach, that helps inform the kind of society you get. And I think those are choices. The history that we tell each other is what we believe to be true generally, or what we want to be true. It's sometimes aspirational, but it's all out there. It's just how do you put it together? How do you put the facts together to tell a particular story? Because you can put them together many different ways.
Well, you don't let Texas be in charge of, have so much influence on textbooks, for one thing, which is what's happened for years and years and years.
Yep.
And many things have been left out.
Well, I guess it always depends on who's writing the books.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
So if most of American history for a very, very, very long time was written by
White people.
white men,
White men.
Mhm.
White men.
then that's what we all learned, and there's
Actually,
still
I think there were probably other writers, but the publishers were white men.
Right.
True.
Yeah.
Right.
I thought another aspect of the book that I noticed this time that I didn't notice as much the first time was how often on their travels, and it's many times it's Kirsten, but there are others, talk about the nature around them, the plants and the wildflowers and the animals and the birds and the growth of things are growing. And so that's another, to me, I guess, aspect of looking, hopefully they're looking at that. And in fact, I think she says something about what if there were no people. She wasn't sad. It was sort of calming in a way because of what we had done to the earth in the past and not taking care of it. And so here's the resilience of nature. And maybe, thinking about treating that differently in the future when they have a chance to do more than just survive. I thought that was interesting too.
But isn't that again showing what's actually happened right now? Because during this pandemic, they noticed the air quality in so many of these
Yeah.
big cities suddenly became much better.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
No.
Wildlife
Less-
was
less traffic.
flourishing, you know.
Yeah.
It goes to
Mhm.
show what humans are doing
Yeah.
to the planet.
Well, and I think.
Well, did
one of the-
any of you ever?
That's okay.
Go on.
What I was going to say is that it made me think, what your comment, Jane, as I was reading, made me think of, even so this has gone on for almost 11 months, right? You know, our own shutdown. How many people are much more into nature now than they were a year ago?
Mhm.
People are taking more walks. People are paying more attention to birds
Yeah.
and to wildlife and to flowers, and because so much of what usually consumes us is gone right now. You know, we're not able to do what we normally do, most of us. And so there's been a lot written about how much more people are really appreciating the natural world because they're spending more time in the natural world.
Outside, safer to be outside.
Yeah.
Mhm. That's true.
Joe, did you want to try to get in your comment and
Yeah.
then we'll
Well,
go to
I
Sue?
just wanted to say, I happened to be in Detroit after the collapse, a number of years after the collapse of the auto industry. And it was remarkable how many buildings were actually having trees growing out of them in the middle of a big city. I was just appalled. And this book really brought that back to me. And my daughter was in Russia after the collapse, when the wall went down, maybe 7 years later, when Russia was at its lowest. She said it was just unbelievable to see these people and what they had to do to eat. And we're kind of in something like that now, not any of us probably up here, but I found it interesting too that the setting was around the Great Lakes, because they say this is going to be where people will come when there's a problem.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Sue, did you? Oh,
there
sorry.
was a story on where they were looking at with global warming, what's the safest place to live? And it was Madison, Wisconsin.
Interesting.
Well, the Great Lakes
Yeah.
will be probably the only really big, will be the biggest freshwater. And
Right.
if people want
Mhm.
water, that's where they're going to have to be too.
They,
Sue, what
they,
were you
they said on the news tonight that one of the biggest shortages was canning jars last year, because so many people did their own gardening
Mm-hmm.
and canned their food, or else they couldn't find the jars to can. So that definitely was a change back to home gardening.
Mhm, mhm. So now that you can completely compare the fictional Georgia flu to what the pandemic we've gone through, but were there other things you felt the author got accurate that compare to what we've been through the last year?
The rise of cults like the prophets.
And I think just that kind of gradual realization of things going from, normal to not normal, and then realizing, oh, well, it's going to be like this for a while. Because we actually happened to be in Florida when things kind of started. We were actually on vacation, and every day more things closed, more things we couldn't do. And finally we were thrilled to get a airplane trip back to Wisconsin before it totally shut down. But I kind of had that feeling as forget the character's name at the start of the book was featured, how he and his brother were just watching things evolve on TV. And I kind of had that same feeling. You were just watching like, oh my God, every day something else is kind of going offline. I think you did.
I think Arthur too, towards the end, when he was finally realizing that he doesn't want possessions, the main thing he wanted to do was to get back to see his son, and be around people that he cared about. And I think more and more people are realizing how important family is. Maybe not everybody, but a lot of us are realizing that, that's what we do. That's where our gut is with our family, and and with those people that we love, and a lot of the things that we thought were so important in our lives are maybe not quite so important anymore.
Well, that kind of wraps up well with one thing the author said, was that she feels it's not an author's place to try to impose a single meaning or lesson on readers. But do you feel there were some meanings, maybe some lessons out of this anyway?
Oh, sure.
Any that stand out?
Well, I think that our modern society is pretty, is based on things that can disappear pretty quickly. I think it's more fragile than we think. And I think one of the things that this shows us is that it may not take a whole lot for several things to change deeply in our society. That, you know, electricity only works as long as there's people working in the electrical places where it's produced. If they're not there, it's not working.
Yeah.
You know, so whether they're taken out from a pandemic or whatever it is, I think it brought home to me that it really is more fragile than we tend to think it is. Our society. I don't mean nature or that, but how we live our lives, especially in the first world. Because we don't, too many millions of us don't have the skills that we might need to survive.
Yeah, I agree with that, Jane, and it brings me back to my idea about taking things and people and their jobs for granted. And how quickly, I mean, just think about the toilet paper thing. And everybody, nobody had toilet paper. So who's making that toilet paper? And she did that a couple of times in this book. She took a situation and started linking it and going backwards. And I think it had to do with somebody. Oh, it had to do with Javon's brother, Frank, being paralyzed. And then she talked about somebody invented the gun, and somebody made the bullet, and somebody was raising the little boy that eventually grew up and used that gun to shoot. It was just this string of things. But the idea, as you said, Jane, of how fragile things are. And we've been, without electricity for 2-3 days once here. And that's, I mean, the water doesn't work, you can't flush the toilets, you're cold, your refrigerator doesn't nothing, you can't cook anything. And you think, wow, you took that electricity for granted. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. How fragile it is. Yeah.
Or in our current society, imagine if the internet went down for a week.
Whoa.
Well, we'd probably all survive, but our children who
Yeah.
have jobs that depend on it probably wouldn't do well.
Look how the hospitals, everything's online. They are totally screwed if that would happen.
I think the other lesson too is it's just people are social animals, and they're always going to congregate together, and generally that means that's a good thing.
Something I really did like about it as well is to the question you asked earlier, Tracy, I'm sure there are messages and we all took messages from it, but it was definitely not preachy. It wasn't didactic. It wasn't, here's what you have to do to survive, or she didn't explain why the people who survived. We don't know why those were the resilient people when almost everybody died. Why didn't they die? And she didn't have to explain it. But I certainly found myself wondering, like, why would you folks be the ones, I guess just a strong genetic makeup, or
there was no medical infrastructure to do the research to determine why.
Yeah, right.
That's one of the ways that the prophet worked, because he said they survived because they were chosen.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
And that's what people they like to hear. Prophets work because it feeds what people need to hear.
Right.
But she did go to great lengths to explain why Clark survived. Clark was the one who was got on a plane, and he was so fortunate because he didn't come in contact with anybody who had the virus. And then he got in, he did this, and he sat at a restaurant, and he was so, she kind of took us through his journey. And that's why he survived, was because he simply had the good luck not to come in contact with the virus. Other people couldn't do it. I mean, Arthur didn't die of the virus. He did die of a heart attack. So it is, yeah, you can see where the cults come from. They speak to people's fear.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. So when the pandemic we are finding ourselves in first started to break, there was a number of people that thought of Station 11, as I'm sure those of you that read it with us originally did. And there started a buzz on Twitter, like, have you read Station 11? You should read Station 11. And the author herself actually chimed in and said,
Don't read it.
Don't do it.
Maybe wait a few months. And she said, personally, I wouldn't want to read a pandemic novel in the middle of a pandemic. So how did you feel? Was this okay?
When I started reading it, I actually felt lucky because we still had electricity. We didn't have to deal with, the very primitive kind of survival. We had that. So, the things we temporarily can't do don't seem that awful compared to what these people went through.
And I had read The Stand way back when.
Oh my gosh.
And that still is top of mind for me as soon as the pandemic started. I haven't seen the HBO series, but the book is just something else.
I think that was my first and last Stephen King novel. Take it.
We talked about that at dinner tonight. The Stand.
Are we mostly glad we read this, or should we have waited till later? Did we read it too soon? Was this good?
I liked reading it. Yeah.
I don't think it was, the timing was a problem.
I think it's a good read.
Good.
I'm glad I reread it.
Him too, because I looked at it so differently with the last year.
Right.
I agree.
Yes.
Karen.
I felt the same. Yeah. Have many read The Glass Hotel, her more recent novel?
I have not.
A few of you did.
Would you recommend it to those of us who have not?
I would recommend it, but the thing that bothered me was that she did use a lot of the same devices. Somebody mentioned that, the constant flashbacks back and forth. And I found it a tad derivative, the story, something we all known about. I'm not going to spoil it for people who haven't read it, but she's just such a good writer. It was a good book.
I thought there were some interesting concepts in it. It kept my attention. It's not, well, maybe I shouldn't say it's not a happy story necessarily, but some interesting things to think about.
I would recommend it, but I would wait. Put some time between the reading of this book, Station 11, so that her whole style of writing is fresher. I just give it some time.
Interesting.
I agree.
Don't you think though that so many current novelists jump around in time?
Yeah.
It seems to be something that's just so common now that it's becoming rarer to read something that's actually sequential and chronological, so it seems to be a very popular way of writing currently. At least that's what strikes me.
Yeah.
Maybe it's what I'm reading, but
Tracy, is that a literary device that's being used?
I believe it has been rather popular, perhaps overdone in some areas for the last few years. But so has, so has switching characters. There's so many novels now that have different characters telling their point of view.
They do.
Yeah.
So, they're all, like you said, they're all different literary devices that can be used. And
Well,
some do it more than others, or better than others, I mean to say.
what becomes available to us to read is what publishers think will sell. And,
Right.
that's who kind of decides what's popular.
Right.
Boy, that's true.
Mhm. Well, I feel like we could talk about this for another hour or two, but we should probably wrap up soon. I do want to encourage you to go on to Door County Reads if you haven't already, doorcountyreads.org, and see all the other wonderful programs yet to come. This is the booklet. I sent an email. This is all available at doorcountyreads.org as well. You know, the author keynote is still coming up Thursday, February 11th. If you have questions, maybe you have questions for the author, you can go on to doorcountyreads.org and submit your questions for her. A number of other good, more discussions. If you want to talk more, there's more book discussions. There's a panel on Faces of the Pandemic coming up February 6th. That sounds interesting. We did a little practice trivia today for the Bring Your Own Brunch quiz. That's going to be probably pretty fun, I would think. And Saturday, February 13th, From Book to Screen, where the author and the screenwriter will both be available, because this will be available eventually on HBO for us to watch.
Oh,
Oh, thank you.
I don't have
I was
HBO.
going to ask
Bummer.
if anyone watched it. I thought that actually was on HBO a few years ago. That's not true?
No, not yet, not yet. No.
Oh.
And Morgan has a good point that I was just going to address. There's a program evaluation. If you liked this or didn't, you know, I suppose, you can click on that link or find it on our website, or it's on the front page of doorcountyreads.org, and you can evaluate if you thought this was worth your time.
Tracy, what's our next book, and do you have
next
copies?
book? I'm so glad you asked, because that's where I was going next. Speaking of comics and graphic novels, we are going to read Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant? Not quite a typical what you would think of as a comic or graphic novel, perhaps, but I think it'll be interesting for us to read and discuss. And it may not take you very long. So I encourage you to, if you have time, seek out other comics, other graphic novels, and maybe try a few. There's millions out there, and any different. There's fiction, there's nonfiction, there's graphic memoir. There, you know, try to find some, read some more. And after that, we are going to get a little more serious again and read Cast. So there's still quite a long list on this one. So if you're not already on the list, you should get on the list.
That's fabulous. That book is fabulous.
I'll try to get a few copies here as well for those that can't get on the list soon enough, but please try to reserve that.
Do you have many of the graphic novel there? And if
I
you
do.
can you
I do
uh,
have a
put my
few
name
here now.
right?
Yeah, so give me a call or an email if you want to pick one up. I've got at least 5 copies right now. I also read, this was really short, she also did What I Hate from A to Z. That was just kind of fun.
Yeah,
She,
that would be interesting.
yeah, she is brutally honest with herself and you as a reader. It's amazing. Mhm.
I've only ever seen her cartoons in the New Yorker. I don't know anything else about her.
Well, it's like
Well.
Yeah. I guess so.
Nice seeing you all, ladies. I'm going to say goodbye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank
Bye,
you very much.
Karen.
Coming.
Thanks for your questions.
Thank you,
Thank you
Tracy.
being here.